Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Our summary of our participants sheet shows us that we have participants from near and far, including London, the rest of the UK, international guests, and people from all walks of life. My name is Mpume Mpofu. I am a member of the London ACES Hub, and I will facilitate this evening's discussion. Few logistics to get us started. The event is being recorded and will be available publicly on our YouTube channel, where you can find previous recordings. The London ACES Hub is a network of advocates, survivors, and multidisciplinary professionals who raise awareness about the lifelong impacts of childhood adversity and build emotional resilience. The purpose of this evening: we are here to explore the essential and often overlooked dimension of boarding school education, its potential impact on childhood development through the lens of adverse childhood experiences, or as we refer to it, ACEs. Many of you have personal ties to this topic. You are former boarding school students, current or prospective boarding school parents, professionals involved in shaping education and policy, or interested contributors. Our discussion today is designed to connect your unique perspectives with emerging insights into childhood experiences and mental health. The concept of ACEs traditionally relates to the challenges like neglect, abuse, emotional hardship, and loss during childhood. It is based on work done by Dr. Vincent J. Filetti, the CDC Kaiser Permanente, in the mid-1990s, and the link will be put in the chat. For our discussion this evening, we highlight 6 of the original 10 ACEs: emotional neglect, physical neglect, emotional abuse, physical abuse or bullying, sexual abuse, or abandonment. Interestingly, research shows that the same risks exist in deprived neighborhoods and privileged environments like boarding schools. Early separation from family and the demands of a structured, sometimes isolated setting can impact a child's emotional development in ways that reverberate ACEs. For example, boarding schools may inadvertently introduce emotional neglect, creating subsequent attachment issues. These issues can echo into adulthood and influence how we lead, relate, and parent. Today's session explores how understanding ACEs and modern attachment theory might provide a framework for enhancing boarding education, making it healthier for children's development. We will examine alternative models from countries like Finland and Denmark, which prioritize community and democratic engagement in their educational systems, offering insights into what might be possible here. Our ultimate goal is to foster open and reflective dialogue by recognizing how boarding experiences shape us and our children. We can support parents in making choices that nurture mental health and resilience. So let me explain how the 2 guest speakers will address the topic. Simon will lead us out under the heading My Boarding School Syndrome and its social class context, in which, drawing on 15 years of difficult reflection, Simon will make the case that to understand the effects of boarding on individuals and society properly, we have to place the institution in its social context. He will distinguish between encultured and the accultured. Simon, can I invite you to turn your camera on and join me, please?
Mpume, thank you very much for that introduction. And hello to everybody in virtuality. This is a new experience for me, and it's somewhat daunting to address people I can't actually see, but I'm going to give it my best shot, let's put it that way. I thought I'd start off with a bit of autobiography, because I think it helps if you know where I'm coming from. I'm a somewhat unusual posh, as we say here in the UK. I grew up on a small farm in East Sussex, not urban, not landed estate, and went to pre-prep at 6 in 1954. Weekly boarding, full boarding prep from 1955 to 1960, where unfortunately I was abused by the school doctor during an anal examination. It took me years, in actual fact, to really realise what had gone on. Otherwise, I wasn't particularly maltreated, just lonely, very lonely and neglected. Eastbourne College, 1960 to 64, my public school, was my dad's old school. He was captain of the first 15. I was not. I tried to follow his footsteps to agricultural college, but left after one term. It was full of people I least liked at public school. So I'm going to spare you my somewhat misspent youth because we haven't got very much time. So I'm going to fast forward really. And I never made it to university. So I did eventually become a sort of writer and researcher, and I focused on several issues. The media, devolved politics, conflict resolution. My dad was shot down twice during World War II and was a POW for 5 years, and that left its mark. By early 2000s, I realized my privileged background plus boarding school had contributed to my problems. With hindsight, this awakening was due to ending several years of full-time week psychoanalysis. I won't linger there. And discovering the work of Sue Gerhardt and her wonderful book, Why Love Matters, How Affection Shapes a Baby's Brain. Sue was big on attachment, neurobiology, and Bowlby, a Bessel van der Kolk, which some of you probably have heard of, before his time. At the same time, by chance, I discovered Joyce Chavrin, who was already exploring the trauma of the privileged, in quotes, child in relationship to boarding school. It rang lots of bells. She put me in touch with pioneer Nick Duffel. I went on one of his double weekend workshops in 2006. The rest is history. I went to a Bowlby Centre conference, fired up about the trauma of boarding, and bless them, they invited me to write up my Duffel workshop for their attachment journal, published in 2007 as Trauma at the Threshold. An 8-year-old goes to boarding school. So thanks to the Bowlby Centre and some 20 articles later, the list is on the PEP web, and I think the link is in the chat. So let me move from some of the personal aspects to the effects on society. And we have the slide up now, which gives a very broad brushstroke of the disproportionate influence of the privately educated on British society. The dark blue represents the privately educated, which is about 7% of school pupils. So the great majority are not educated privately. But if you look down the chart, you can see the predominance of the dark blue. And like most data, it isn't disaggregated, unfortunately. So less than 1% of boarding schools are not shown separately from day schools. And if it was, I think the disproportion would be very much greater. For example, in Johnson's cabinet in September 2021, I did a fine analysis. 8 of his 30 members went to private boarding schools. That was 27% of the cabinet, compared with 0.7% of the UK school pupils, and 3 of those went to Eton. So I think this is a good example of the very strong influence private schooling has on British society. Between 2011 and 2015, clinical evidence and research into boarding residential schools in the UK and Canada, where the First Nations were incarcerated in truly appalling conditions, and where psychiatrist Dr. Charles Brasfield identified residential school syndrome as early as 2000, coalesced into the conception of boarding school syndrome. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is the cover of Joy Chavarin's book, published in 2015, which really caused a stir. And even the Daily Telegraph, a right-wing newspaper in Britain, asked if Cameron was suffering, Prime Minister Cameron was suffering from BS syndrome, after in the House of Commons he called said to a female colleague, "Calm down, dear." So it started to penetrate quite widely in British society and discussion. And Chavarin really put boarding schools on the map in lots of ways. She described her work as psychoanalytically focused and identified an A, B, C, and D of BS syndrome. A for abandonment, B for bereavement and homesickness, C for captivity, D for defensive dissociation. She put great emphasis on A, but from about 2010, I felt this didn't fit my own family boarding experience well. But it wasn't until my 2021 paper, Boarding School Syndrome Reconsidered, which is available on the London ACES Hub website, that I managed to articulate there was for me two types of BS syndrome. The PTSD type articulated by Chavarin and Brasfield, and a more complex type experienced by multiple generation boarders like myself. I called the latter upper class complex trauma condition, which I now think was not particularly helpful because it sounds too clinical. In my view, the complex variety infects a whole social class. Let me try to explain with the help of a graphic, which appears in my upcoming paper, an attachment in December. Next slide, please. So if you look at this socio-spatial graphic, the large oval upper circle represents the culture of the British upper class, which is less than 1% of the population. Within the large oval, there are two smaller ovals. One is the stiff upper lip family, and the other one is the boarding school. And as you'll see, they overlap. And this shows the idea of the environment of adaptiveness is one of Bowlby's fundamental ideas. If one could animate that graphic, I think over time, and one has to include a sort of longer a time dimension here, they would increasingly merge. So the family becomes the school, and the school becomes the family, and it becomes really almost impossible to differentiate the two, which is one of the reasons why I think we find it so difficult to describe what's going on in this remarkably small group of people. So the other class cultures oval at the bottom really in reality should be many times larger than the top oval. And I think that's one reason why it's so difficult to escape from this very powerful social matrix. In my 2023 paper, Enculturation, Acculturation, Positionality and Power, I described those with complex BS syndrome as encultured, and those simply with BS syndrome as accultured. These terms are borrowed from anthropology rather than psychotherapy. And if I had more time, I would go into the work of Judith Oakley, a brilliant social anthropologist, who in actual fact wrote the first reflective account of a girls' boarding school in 1978, long before Nick Duffel got going. The encultured usually have a less abrupt entry to boarding school. They feel that I felt they feel less abandoned. The insecure, avoidant attachment style of the stiff upper lip provides protection against the deficient nurture of boarding school. A great explanation of this comes from the attachment-based psychotherapist Anne Power and her paper, Rich Children in Care, Their Adaptation to the Loss of Attachment, which she published in 2013, alongside a paper of mine. I wanted to check out the coinage, and the best I could do was to test it on a sample of some 60 respondents drawn from the Boarding School Survivors Facebook, a private group I belong to. We lack the sort of quantitative knowledge which the ACEs study of 17,000 plus provided in 1998, which Mpume referred to, and which gave such a boost to the ACEs movement. It would be great to have a large sample survey of ex-boarders and measure what their attachment styles are in relationship to their family history. The longer the experience, the more detached I would expect them to be. And I think that's, I can say that from personal experience. My great-grandfather went to Eton. Whether that can be done in practice is another matter. I don't know how you would reach such people. Slide 5, please. Sorry, I think I've got the order slightly wrong here. Anyway, this is a report from one of the survivors who responded to my request. It's with their consent, and obviously the problem was all these things have to be completely confidential. But I think he explains very clearly how he was an outsider who was sent to boarding school by aspirational parents. And one of the reasons he suffered so badly was because he was perceived as an outsider by the majority of people in the school. I'm afraid he was actually terribly abused. Of course, it's not necessarily a typical sample, but I think it's there as a useful indication. So I'll just wait briefly so you can read it. Next slide, please. So my view of the overall view of people like myself who come from families who have a long history of boarding is that over time this leads to a certain psychological type, plus the indoctrination which goes with the institution. So we have the stiff upper lip with its emotional frigidity, detachment, avoidance, and dissociation. We have a sense of entitlement because you've entered this very exclusive group of people. And I don't think this is necessarily conscious, but it just gets imbibed by being in such an exclusive environment. Exclusive either because most people can't afford it, or in actual fact, something that's learned after a while. So the last aspect is discriminatory behavior. Because in actual fact, one is in this exclusive environment, cut off from ordinary people, and one just doesn't have and in an institution historically associated with empire, slavery, and subjugation. So I would like to suggest in conclusion, there are two types of BS syndrome. One caused by the use of boarding over a long time, the other more by first-time reactions. I think this will be useful for clinical work. A key question would be, how many generations of boarding in your family? And I think it would also help us better understand the institution's far-reaching effect on wider society and why change is very difficult. Finally, to those of you who may have experienced the enforced residential schools for the indigenous in my audience, I don't know who's there, but I'm sure some people have or know about it. I want to acknowledge with respect and with apology as a white Brit, that experience was infinitely worse than any boarding in the UK. Thanks very much for your attention.
Simon, thank you very much. I always want to honor when people share their life stories. You've allowed us into the privacy of your life. Thank you for that. And I hope that it is stirring a discussion among us in respect of the impact of boarding on children and young people. On that note, then, let me invite my second colleague, Morag, under the heading, Boarding Schools Have Changed, Haven't They? How Early Boarding Harms Young Children, Even in the Best Schools. Over to you, Morag.
Thank you for the introduction, Mpume, and Simon for your very detailed reflections. As you can see, my name is Morag. I'm an ex-boarder. I attended a co-ed boarding school in Scotland. I've written a book about my boarding experience, linking this with my background in child psychology. The book is called Almost Boys, and my author name is Isabel Ross. But the most important thing about me for this evening is my over 30 years experience as an educational psychologist with a background in adverse childhood experiences and attachment theory. When I look at my slides, we're going to be doing a London ACES Hub version of the Still Faces experiment, because I'm going to need to look down to read my notes, but I hope that you will be tolerant of that. So could I have my first slide, please? So as we've heard already, adverse childhood experiences were common in boarding schools, even in the not too distant past. But boarding schools have changed, haven't they? We hear this often. To reflect on this question requires evidence, but there's a dearth of research based on boarding school populations. So to find some answers, I have looked at research involving children in care, and I've also looked at the latest in attachment theory. Could I have my second slide, please? The relationship between adverse childhood experiences and attachment quality is cyclical. But one ACE that may remain common may be a factor in boarding schools today is abandonment. Children may suffer from one ACE or a complex combination of ACEs. Prevalence rates are currently 2.5%. And the most common reported is parental separation, and I mean by that toxic separation, and emotional abuse through shouting and name calling. Early boarding is not an ACE. When ACEs are intense and prolonged, there is a complex biological reaction in the child's body, resulting from elevated stress levels. This impacts on the quality of the attachment formed with parents and carers. It also affects brain development, social and emotional relationships, and future health. When we look at attachment quality, a secure attachment is the most common. So well done, parents. Parents are a safe haven to retreat to and a secure base to explore from. Less common is the category of insecure attachments, which is broken into two subcategories, anxious avoidant and anxious ambivalent, which you might see in the literature also called resistant. Simon has already mentioned some of the features of the avoidant character, but I won't go into great detail about these today because there isn't time. But both are coherent and organized responses to the circumstances in which the child finds themselves, and may in fact serve to bring parents closer. The least common attachment quality is disorganized attachment, and this sadly is where parents are unreliable, chaotic, and may even be frightening. Research tells us that a network of attachments is important. So the child may begin with a secure attachment to their parents, but very soon that will extend out to grandparents, perhaps another family member, a childminder, a school teacher, and all of these attachments are very important. An attachment is not just a relationship. A child can have many relationships with many adults. An attachment, a secure attachment, is very special, and it's where the adult is a safe haven. Having a network of attachments protects a child against future adverse childhood experiences. That doesn't mean that bad things can't happen, but when your parents have your back and they are there to love and support you, you will rebound. Could I have my next slide, please? So what is the current situation as regards boarding schools and attachment and adverse childhood experiences? The answer is that we just don't know, because the research is not done on boarding school populations. So first, I want to introduce what are the key factors for child development. Firstly, society must plan to protect children against ACEs and the impact of ACEs. So something like a domestic violence prevention strategy, for example, at a government level would be an example of that. We also have to help parents. We have to help parents to be supported and to be valued. And there are many programs. The one that we're probably all familiar with was Sure Start, which sadly was given up by subsequent governments. But there are programs around, like the Solihull approach, where parents can seek help. Research suggests that the key factor is parental sensitivity. So their response to a child's distress is accurate and timely. The parents notice what's happening. And that may surprise you that I actually even raise that. But what we know from insecure attachment is one of the problems is that parents actually don't notice what's happening. So the parents notice what's happening and they predict, they intervene, they explain. They are able to hold the child's distress and help the child cope. They are able to comfort the child. Time is key. Secure attachment relationships don't just happen. They grow over time and they are not transferable. A child's safe haven is continuous. They're always there. There are no breaks. Sensitive parents will set boundaries when needed, but they are not bound by rules. They can be flexible, and they value the child's stage, not the child's age. They will also be comfortable with rupture and repair. And I haven't got time to go into rupture and repair today, but if anybody wants to look it up, you'll see how important this is in child development. Could I have the next slide, please? So what about part-time boarding? Does that protect a child's existing secure attachments? The child will take a safe haven for granted. They have no awareness of a life outside this. And that is why it is so hard to prepare a child for boarding school, because they don't know what we're talking about. And it's one of my memories of going to boarding school was my realization that this strange world had been going on all the time I'd been alive. And that was quite a shock. So boarding schools reassure parents that mobile phone contact is possible, unlike when we were at boarding school when no telephone contact was possible. But a phone does not have touch. It doesn't have warmth, and access to a phone is likely to be time limited, other than not like a cuddly conversation with a parent. Let's talk about staff ratios. Many boarding houses now, particularly for the 7 to 12-year group, will have house parents who will have children of their own, an assistant house parent. The best ratios that I found from looking at brochures was 2 house parents and an assistant house parent to 12 girls. But if we think that these house parents have children of their own, one of them will be off duty, looking after their own children. So is it really a home from home to have 2 adults putting 12 children to bed? So care staff in a boarding house have to clock off. One house parent will clock off. Other members of staff will have shifts. So continuity of personal contact is not possible. In the best run school, what are the threats? If we say with hope that the threats, the ACEs of the past, are not there, where are the threats? There is likely to be bullying. No school can claim that their dormitories are bullying free at night. And small children have big worries. These may not seem like big, important worries to us, but they are to a small child. And in a family environment, these would be addressed straight away with care and in detail. Parents are on the sidelines for the first time in the child's life. If the child's going part-time, the parents will know the school, they might well know the teachers, but they don't know the boarding environment. And this is the first time in a child's life where the rules of the boarding house, the strange routines, the unusual words used for ordinary things, the parents don't know. And so the child is experiencing a life that their parents cannot know. What about adolescence? There's a lot about weekly boarding for adolescents, which might work. But if we remember, this is a time of brain restructuring and of puberty, and adolescents' need for parents at this time is strong, even if they seem to be rejecting us. One of the biggest problems for adolescents is the loss of community. A child who goes to boarding school termly or weekly will lose contact with local children, and like many of us who were boarders will remember holidays with nobody to play with or speak to. Next slide, please. So when I look through the brochures, it seems that resilience and independence are what is being sold to parents. And we do value these as a culture, but these are not essential attributes for 7 to 12-year-olds. These children of this age will develop resilience and independence throughout a typical childhood and at their own pace. And it's not linear. Bowlby identified 3 stages in abandonment: protest, despair, and detachment. And he noted that the child will settle for detachment and the business of survival. And this happens because, and we see it in the brochures, that boarding schools focus on busyness and keeping the child so active that they are not able to focus on their own distress. And so the feelings are put away and the child becomes detached from their own feelings. Ex-boarders note that this resilience and independence is actually a deficit in their relationships, even if it helps them with progress at work. So the foundation for resilience and independence in our children is a secure attachment that protects against adverse childhood experiences. It's not breaking a child's attachment relationships and separating from their family. So even in the best of boarding school environments, I have to conclude that there is still a case that the ACE of abandonment still exists. Thank you for your attention and time.
Morag, thank you very much for sharing your life, and I honor that again. Simon, may I invite you to turn your camera on as well? Let me be the first one to just put a question there that was niggling at the back of my mind. Simon, you mentioned the idea of deprivation, being removed from home and going to boarding school at a very young age. Is that what Bowlby refers to as maternal deprivation?
I'm sure he would. I think that I think the complication, Mpume, is that the whole and not everybody comes from this background who goes to boarding school. I recognize that. But if you come from a family where, in my case, there was 3 generations on my mother's side of boarding, in actual fact, I think you're talking about and a family maybe that outsourced childcare within the family to nannies. It's not just that the deprivation occurs within the family. And Bobby knew this because he came from an upper class Edwardian family, and he and his siblings were actually exiled to the nursery. They were taken down 1 hour every evening to meet the parents. So one has to, and I'm not saying it's completely like that these days, but there is a culture which is which isn't just boarding school, which I think is actually emotionally deprived. And I mean, this in a way for me is what the term stiff upper lip actually refers to. It's not a technical term, but it's actually kind of normalizing emotional deprivation.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's one of the things which motivate. I mean, Bobby was actually saved in a way by his very loving nursemaid, Minnie Croft Ashbolt, who is the unsung hero in the background.
Yeah.
I've done a little bit of research on her, but there's very little written about her.
Okay. No, appreciate that. And while you were speaking, Morag, I went back to a discussion we've had before, which is we're discussing these things as if they're esoteric, but in reality, where do we find boarding school survivors in our day-to-day lives? Who are these people that we need to be, or maybe some of us are them? Who are we talking about here?
Well, we're talking about us, and we're talking about many of our friends and colleagues, but the people we interact with in daily life who are senior in their organization, if you say have a serious illness and you think your consultant lacks a bedside manner, is there a chance that they were a boarder? Because the research does seem to suggest that the qualities that a boarder acquires leads them to do well at work, but not in relationships. And that is the struggle that many boarders have when they hit depression and anxiety, often in middle age, and have to seek help because the life that they were led to expect has led them to be deprived in relationships.
Which ties into I've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. One from Pippa, which says, would it be fair to surmise that boarding school creates a false resilience and independence because they are masks, maladaptive coping strategies, rather than traits built on a secure foundation? That's the question from Pippa. And then there's another one from an anonymous attendee. What kind of therapeutic approaches do you think can be effective in prevention and recovery? So if I can ask both of you to just field both questions for now, and there's another one which has come up, and then I'll read that as well. I've still got a few more questions, by the way.
When I read through current boarding school brochures, they talk about homesickness and reassure parents at how effective they are at dealing with it, and how very, very quickly, amazingly for parents, the child becomes independent and resourceful. And I am concerned that this is because of Bowlby's 3 stages of distress, despair, and detachment, and it's being mistaken for independence. And the child is praised for it and carries this style through the rest of their lives. Because there's no safe haven. There is no safe haven for the child to go to, so the distress has to be put away.
Okay.
Yes. And I think we have to ask a slightly broader question, and that is, why do we, as a culture, I think, influenced by the elite, in my view. Why do we place so much emphasis on independence? Because at a certain level, we know we're all dependent on each other, really. I mean, it's a kind of where do these cultural norms come from, in a sense? And I think quite a lot of the defective cultural norms in our society actually fall out from this kind of, how can I put it, peculiar pedagogy. It strikes me that in some ways there's a group of people who've decided who could well look after their children at home, just to send their children off to orphanages, really, with the kind of lack of institutions, as I think Morag pointed out, actually can't look after children very well. In a sense, it's going against the grain of that sort of fine attunement and care for which can happen in a caring family.
Mm. Mm. And I think that links well with a comment in the chat that Annette has put in. You can feel kind of institutionalized. You're be high on alert regularly. By virtue of having lost and being in an institution and so forth. So I quite like that notion of a false sense of resilience and independence. This idea about I'm widening my child's social network. But the question is at what price?
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to go back to a point that we discussed when we were setting all this up. Why does this matter?
Shall I go first?
Sure.
It matters at the individual child level because all children matter. It doesn't matter if your parents have paid for something that appears to be privileged. If that is harmful for the child, particularly for a young child, we should as a society speak out against it. When you step back from the thought of boarding school, if you're not part of that culture, and you think about sending away a child of 7 or 8 out of the family, even if it is only to sleep 3 nights away, it doesn't make any sense. A family is where a child is meant to be. Parents and carers are meant to be the people who are bringing it up. Yeah. But as Simon has made very clear, there's an impact in society which goes much broader than the individual child. So I care very much about the individual child, but I do recognize the importance in society, and perhaps Simon could pick that up.
And before you do that, Simon, I just want to read a comment from Hamish, which says, Morag, you and I went to the same institution and it was much unchanged until the 2000s. Oh. How do you think that taking a child from a safe environment and dropping them into a Bosalino-like environment, where it runs like a scene from either the movie Scum or Lord of the Flies, yeah. And do the schools have a duty to try and help fix these people?
Well, the schools were in loco parentis. That was the deal. And being a parent is a lifetime responsibility. Yeah. So if they were truly in loco parentis, then they are responsible for us all our lives. Yeah. I would agree with that, yes.
Simon?
I've lost the thread a bit, Mpume. What was the original query?
The whole idea of creating a sense of resilience and independence, and children maturing quickly to be better people by virtue of being independent.
Yeah, it's I think this falls very problematically with me, because I think, if I'm honest, this is a difficult thing to say. The family I came from wasn't very safe. I mean, I think it's too easy to assume that I find this quite a lot in the sort of discourse around boarding schools, that the families are safe and boarding schools aren't. Whereas I think quite a lot of people, in fact, I think in some ways one would have to say if one did a kind of a proper survey of upper middle class families from an attachment perspective, I think one would have to say that actually they're not safe places. So the sort of irony is if you're kind of used to a not safe space, in other words, you have a kind of quite high level of detachment, going to another space where there's also not very safe, in some ways, unfortunately, is quite familiar. I mean, and I think that's the danger because, as Morag pointed out earlier on, what sort of people close Sure Start centres? You know, that was a government policy. And I think I have to draw a link between people who can actually enact that sort of social policy and their own experiences of familyhood. And just a little sort of anecdote of my own. Um, I was a step granddad for a while, and I think one of the things which really brought home to me what it was like to be a little boy in a boarding school at 7 was when my step grandson got to the age of 7, and my wife wasn't very well, so I looked after him a lot. Unfortunately, she had cancer at the time, and it was I just thought this was a revelation. There was this sort of really vulnerable, dependent boy who he liked nothing more than to sort of curl up in the crook of my arm, you know. And that was a kind of, I mean, I learned an awful lot from him
Yeah.
because that actually was a novel experience.
Yeah.
And there was a kind of tactile deprivation within my family.
Right.
So it's quite complicated, I think.
Yeah.
And I just don't make it, I mean, I think where I sort of part company with some of the discourse around boarding school survivorship is I think it's too easy to assume that the family is a cozy place. I'm not saying it's desperately unsafe, but you know, there's a lack of coziness in my experience, which I
That's true.
find quite difficult. I find it painful to confront it actually.
Simon, thank you. Let me jump in because we can talk until much
Yeah.
much. I need to move us along. There's a series of questions that have come up while we were talking, so I'm paying attention to those. As I promised, we'll try and tackle them in the next session. But even if we don't tackle them in the next session, we'll respond to people directly from there. I'd like to take us forward to the conclusion. It's well and good to unpack what the issue is. But let's look at next steps. And the title we're using is Beyond Boarding Towards an Integrated Education System. Beyond boarding towards an integrated education system. Could you start us off in what that might look like? What exactly are we looking towards in this next steps beyond boarding? Who wants to tackle it first? You want to go first, Simon? Simon, please.
I'll have a go, but I would like to say I think there might be more resources in the audience than there is in the panel. I mean, I'm not going to assume that, you know, I would want to actually encourage people to contribute their ideas, because I have to admit that my focus has been more on the criticism of the existing institutions than thinking through alternatives. And I'm not an expert on educational policy. But I just briefly point to some things which have crossed my horizon, and that is that the Finnish system, where they had a really big debate in the 1970s about what was the purpose of education in Finnish society, and they came to the conclusion that they wanted to do away with fee-paying education, and which they did. Now, not all the schools are controlled by the state, but in actual fact, you can't charge fees. I mean, there are one or two international schools, but apart from that, all the money comes from via taxation. And education there doesn't start. I mean, the other thing that we do here is we start our formal education very early. And in the Scandinavian countries and Denmark, they tend not to start formal education till 7, and up until then, it's a very play-based system of sort of exploration. So I think that's one model worth looking at, and yeah, there's been, I think Scotland's gone further than anywhere else in the UK in exploring some alternatives, and some of us will know Suzanne Zeedijk, who's involved in that. She's in the States at the moment. There are the Efterskoler in Denmark, which are small boarding schools, not businesses. You can't. They're voluntary. And actually, I did do a bit of research. There are more people in small boarding schools in Denmark than there are in private boarding schools in the UK. I think it was about 3% rather than less than 1%. And you can go for 2 or 3 years. You can volunteer to go for 2 or 3 years, and they're very much focused on once they feel kids have got to the point where they want to experience something a bit outside the familial context, what it is to live in a group, the responsibilities groups have, and the idea one has some broader civic responsibility in society. So their philosophy is really not around purely independence, you know, and resilience and competitiveness, if you like. And then there's just recently there's been this very interesting alternative education summit put together by a group called Limitless and Progressive Education, and I've dropped into 1 or 2 of those sessions. So there are lots of people actually at the moment experimenting with different forms of education, some of it homeschooling, some of it small democratically run schools, which have been around for quite a long time. And I think people also realizing there's a kind of cornucopia of educational material now available on digital networks. And really, do we need to rethink the whole idea of a school being some sort of fixed place? Could it be something more like a community center where learning takes place, not necessarily even just for young people? You see, one of the things about boarding is if you have a business model, theoretically, the marketplace is the world. So it's kind of very useful, but is that a good idea? Should people in actual fact have some sense of their locality and where they come from? And so I think that, I mean, these anyway, I've thrown out some ideas, but you know, that's just some of the things which
I think that's helpful to get us thinking.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Morag, you want to try and come in on this idea of what's coming next, please?
Well, I would like as a society to consider whether boarding school for young children is actually something that we will tolerate as a society. I'd like to see an actual debate about that. The second thing is that boarding schools, as we know, they do exist for 7 to 12-year-olds. And we actually, through scrutinizing the research, particularly the research on children in care and training for foster carers, that we do actually know how to help a child create new secure attachments. And we know from the research that a network of attachments is beneficial. So if you are boarding young children in your environment, why not take an attachment-based approach and try, and instead of focusing on resilience and independence and keeping children busy and so on, why not focus on helping these young children in your care to create new attachments to your members of staff. And we know that that will protect their existing attachments to their family and will give them the benefit of new secure attachments into the future. So there's two things, that there's that, and there's the questioning whether do we really want children under 12 being educated away from their families as a society. And the other thing is that we need more research. All of the evidence comes from adult ex-boarders who are a selected group. Nobody is doing action research with groups of young children who are just starting at boarding school and following them through. So we could have some real evidence in which to base our education provision.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I don't know if both of you know that the boarding school model was exported very successfully. Now, I grew up in what was Southern Rhodesia. It's called Zimbabwe now. And yeah, at the ripe old age of 12, I went boarding. But our boarding schools were focused around the religious groups that came in. So you went to boarding school and you were completely and thoroughly indoctrinated with what was believed to be the faith. And I see a lot of us now around the world that operate in a certain way with a certain worldview that itself is a product of boarding schools. So yes, I think the challenge remains about how do we look elsewhere for models that work and see if we can bring them and apply them. Because I think for me, the central point, and I'm just saying this may not be true for others, for me, the central point is if I'm a parent whose child is boarding, or if I'm a parent who's considering sending my child to boarding school, what do I have to take into account? I think there's a discussion point on that one, and also the point that you've highlighted for those that are survivors of boarding schools. What should we learn from it by research? Let me just open this then to others to put questions, to put ideas, put resources, but still with the both of you, any additional comments that you want to bring. And if anybody, if this is evoking some distressing feelings for some, we've put a link in the chat function for you to be able to get help there if anybody needs that. I just need to point that out again. But let me come back to you, Simon. What is additional that we need to take into account about how we take this thing forward, how we influence? And I know you mentioned the Johnson government and how 27% of it was made up of people who came out of boarding schools and would maybe have found it difficult to relate to the rest of us that don't have that experience.
Where to start? That's a difficult one. I think it's unfortunate that the new government actually started with this rather kind of simplistic putting VAT on all private schools without making any distinction between boarding schools and day schools, for instance. And there's a great variety among private day schools. Some seem to me to be doing good and interesting work, you know. So I don't think that was a helpful move. How do we open up this debate? I think Morag's made a very good point, which now seems to have quite wide backing. That really we should actually ask a very serious question about primary school boarding. I mean, it seems to me there's very little. The developmental psychology is against it. What is the advantage really of it? And I think the other thing which is very worrying is that boarding schools in the UK are now increasingly dependent on pupils from overseas. And in actual fact, I mean, we know this from the third culture kids research, you know, that a lot of the most extreme cases of boarding school trauma come from kids who've been sent from overseas.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a very worrying area. We just, I mean, the evidence we have so far is mostly anecdotal, and as Morag points out, it's understandably people who either are therapists who, in actual fact, such as Joy Chavarin, who have come across some of their clients who've been very badly affected by boarding school, or survivors like us who've been affected more or less. And clearly, we're obviously speaking from our own rather subjective experience, which doesn't invalidate it, but makes it very difficult to use as a base for policy initiatives.
Mm.
And the fantastic, I mean, in actual fact, I discovered that it was Bowlby who coined the phrase adverse childhood experiences back in 1980. Because it grew out of his own research. But it wasn't until Felicity and Ander managed to get that fantastic research project where they persuaded Kaiser Permanente to survey 17,000 plus people, which really came up with absolutely solid evidence that people started to take it seriously. And that's a kind of a bit of a chicken and egg situation. I would think now we might, and maybe this is in the wake of the VAT thing, which seems to have gone very badly, to go to the government and say, look, yeah, we do need some new initiatives in the educational field, but could we have some decent research before we set off down a road, and there are unintended consequences we haven't thought about. So, and there are some people in the private sector who I think see which way the wind is blowing and would be possibly quite cooperative, you know. They're nice middle class people who want the best for their kids. They're not necessarily oligarchs who are just climbing up the ladder.
Yeah. Very helpful. And let me point out for everybody's information that we're back into Q&A again. So I'll be able to pick up some more questions that are here. But I'd like if we can keep exploring the issue of what is possible rather than just unpicking what the problem is. So I'm looking at the questions, and I just want to go to one question which we sort of touched on, but I think is also helpful in respect of where to next. The question was, if I can find it, what kind of therapeutic approaches do you think can be effective in recovery? So instead of in prevention and recovery, I just want to ask and say, what can be done around recovery? Simon, it struck me the way you said after 15 years of struggling with it. So if someone right now is a survivor of boarding schools, what's out there that people can take advantage of? If I can start with you, please, Morag.
Oh, I think there's so many different therapies and support groups available, and I think it's a good idea to go to Seen and Heard for advice, because they have a list of therapists on their website, or the boarding school survivors group, and get recommendations. But there's the whole range. There's individual therapy, there's group therapy, ex-boarders weekends, online therapy. That there is so much out there, EMDR, and nearly everyone will have supporters of one model or another amongst them. But one of the things that does seem to come through everybody is that if you are having counselling or therapy, find a therapist who has experience of boarding themselves. Because there is a view amongst ex-boarders that therapists who haven't been boarders, struggle to understand the depths of the problems. And I believe that ex-boarders are difficult to work with. And I say that myself, as someone who's been in therapy as an ex-boarder. You want therapy, you want to feel better, but you'll resist it like mad. And it needs to be someone very skilled that you work with who can understand and work that through. But no, there's all different models seem to work. It depends what suits you as an individual.
Okay, yeah. I just need to point out that in the chat, Chantal has made reference to a 1968 Royston Lambeth Massive University Sociological Research Project in all types of boarding schools in the UK. She said it's rarely quoted, but an amazing ethnographic study, 2 books on it, well worth a read, and the Hothouse Society and the State and Boarding School Education. Those are resources that somebody has pointed out. And within the chat as well, Pippa has given her email address for those that would like to contact and so forth. Then it's a question for you, Simon, here. It says, Simon, did I hear you right that you interviewed 60 members of the Boarding School Survivors Facebook group for your latest paper?
No, I didn't interview them, and it's not the latest paper, it's the one before. But I was trying to test out these 2 ideas I had of enculturation, acculturation.
Yeah.
And the only sort of group I could reach as an individual with no resources was the Facebook survivors group I belonged to. It was a bit of a risk. So I put a draft of that up on the Facebook page and invited comments. And I half expected brickbats and people to say, you're intruding on our privacy. But actually, and I suppose I'm sort of reasonably well known there now. I got a very helpful response. But again, I'd have to say, it's a self-selected group. Everybody there has their own kind of baggage, So, but it did prove that, which I think is one of the issues, is that what some people get actually bullied because they are seen as outsiders when they enter this institution, which usually, not always, has a kind of a sort of upper class feel to it and history. So it seemed to me what I drew from that was actually I'd made a distinction, which is quite helpful. I wouldn't really say very much more than that, given the lack of the inevitable bias in the sample and the small size of it. But it gets back to Morag's point. We just don't have decent quantitative research, and I think I said that in the paper quite explicitly. No, I wish I mean, there are other ways of measuring attachment styles, but the adult attachment interview would be great if you could get enough people.
That's a very good point for the next question that I'm looking at, Simon. Sorry, Morag, I'll come to you in a moment. But and this, I'm reading it from our role as the London ACEs Hub. And the question is, do you think it is possible to remove your attachment from the unhealthy and return to a healthy attachment even in adulthood? That's the first part. And then Felicity is also, Felicity, for those that don't know, is also part of the London ACEs Hub. Felicity has also put a comment which says, why do you think that there is resistance in these patients? I've noticed that they can't bring themselves to blame their parents for making this decision. So what's your view around this issue of I have an insecure attachment now, I'd like to fix it? And you made reference to the adult attachment interview. Could you say something about how do we change this narrative as adults now that we know that some of our attachment was insecure?
The research shows that attachment classifications are only moderately stable over time anyway. So yes, you can make changes. Children can be helped to change, and so can adults. I think that if you have some very bad things happen to you, then you can actually, your secure attachment can become quite vulnerable. And in the same way, if you have an insecure attachment relationship style, and life goes well for you, and particularly if you meet a very loving partner, you can become more securely attached over time. And a relationship-driven model of therapy ought to be able to help you reevaluate, identify your attachment style and reevaluate it and help you to change. I think it's important to understand that these are not fixed.
Sure.
And they're not predictive, even in children.
Yeah. Here's another question. I'm just conscious of the time. So Simon, sorry to cut across you. What kind of therapeutic support would you like to see in schools, boarding schools and day schools?
Morag, do you want to have a go at that?
Well, mindfulness is going very well in schools. That seems to be working very well. And most schools, most primary schools have taken on a mindfulness program of some sort or another.
Would that be suitable then for those children that are currently boarding?
Definitely, yes. All the strategies and provisions that are available in state schools should also be picked up by boarding schools. Yeah, they work.
Within the context of that, then, what should I do as a parent if I've placed my child in boarding school, and for the first time I'm hearing these issues and possible impact on my child? What am I supposed to do as a parent?
I think. Sorry, Simon. You want to kick off?
Well, I just think that there's I think there is a problem in that our therapy models are still quite individually directed. So it's, you see, I think one of my problems coming from my background was that and you know I hope I have changed to a considerable extent, but my parents are dead, so it's not a kind of immediate issue. But on the Boarding School Survivors Facebook group, I mean there are endless comments of how difficult it is to relate to parents. You know, if you start changing, you then fall outside your family's cultural norms, and that is a really big issue. And for me, there's an issue about I can't go back to where I've come from, and this actually is a problem for people who leave class cultures, not just the upper class going downwards or the working class going upwards. It's a real issue we don't address in our society, and I don't have simple answers except to say, look, there's a real issue about crossing class barriers. And so I would say, if you have parents who are quite open, well, they might start asking why am I sending my children to boarding school, particularly if they're under 13. So it can raise quite difficult issues, you know. And I think that individual psychotherapy needs to think more in kind of group cultural terms. But then in actual fact, I think a lot of psychotherapists find that very challenging. So it's a kind of issue which has a lot of implications. And that's probably another reason why change is quite difficult, because you think you're changing something about a school, but you might end up having to change lots of other kind of things, you know, which are related to it. So it's a big issue. And I think I mean, for me, there's a hidden class dimension. I still think it's a taboo topic in our culture, you know, the cultural effects of class, even accent and body language. You know, I mean, I go into places where I open my mouth, and people know where I've come from, and they make a lot of assumptions. I don't blame them. I'm just saying it's a fact of life.
Here's a statement from Hamish, which ends with a question. The boarding school network in New Zealand appears to be quite nurturing. It is weekly for children whose parents live far from schools. But New Zealand is very egalitarian, and the poison of the class system hasn't harmed it like it has here. A lot of the problem is the class system. Do you agree? And before you answer that, Now, I am an outsider of the British system because I come from, as I said, I come from Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
So I've lived here for 20 odd years. And when I look at you, I still look at British. I still see myself as an outsider. But earlier on in the chat, if I can just find it, I've noticed people have come from abroad. They take on jobs here and they work all hours in order to put their children through the better education. There's somebody that, and I'll find their name in a minute. They want to put their children in the best education possible, which is the boarding school. I'm trying to reconcile whether that is driven by wanting their children to be a certain class. Is that true for the Brits as it is for us outsiders who associate boarding school with a certain class?
It's in some ways it's still the gold standard. I mean, I don't know what I mean. Piers Cross, who I think is actually in the audience tonight, did a fascinating interview with an American from the East Coast, who who actually sort of said that she'd read Charles Spencer's book and it alerted her to the whole problem. But she described it as she thought Eton was the ultimate goal till she read Charles Spencer's book, when she suddenly realized the downside to it. And it still carries enormous weight. I mean, I don't pretend to completely understand this, but I think it's the aspirational aspect of it, Mpume, is still immensely strong, Is this the long shadow of empire? I don't know. You might be able to tell me more.
I think so.
Gosh, it's gone on for a long time, hasn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. I'm going to cut across there again because I've only got a couple of minutes and then I've got to make the winding comments. So Morag, forgive me for this one. But there's another statement that's also been made around, is there anything good about boarding schools? I think I'm looking for us to finish on a positive note. I think we've picked out the difficulties associated with it, but it can't all be bad.
They provide what they say on the tin. They produce young adults who are on the surface independent and resilient, who get into the best universities and tend to then get good jobs. Unfortunately, because problems seem to come to a crunch later in life, it's hard to measure. Most ex-boarders seem to start suffering in their 40s, 50s, 60s. And it's almost as if the energy that they got from boarding school and having perhaps a busy, very busy career and young family gets them through their 20s and 30s, and then they hit a wall. And the trouble is that this is very hard to measure in terms of an outcome because it seems to occur late. And so for parents who make that choice, they're often not around anymore to see the suffering of their adult children. But as Simon says, that later on, relationships with elderly parents can become very, very difficult, particularly if an adult ex-boarder is suffering depression and anxiety, and their very elderly parents are very needy and needing help and support, and the adult ex-boarder doesn't want to give it. It can get very complicated. So I think it depends what outcome you're looking for. The short-term outcomes look quite good. It's the later outcomes that are not. But as an educational psychologist, I have to say I did come across adolescents who'd been abandoned within their own family. They were young people whose parents worked from 7 in the morning, perhaps till 8 at night. Yeah. They lived essentially at home alone. There was no one to give them breakfast or dinner. There was no one to talk to them about their homework, their interests. And many of these young people were turning to alcohol and drugs. Now, I have to say that at the time, I did think that 5-day-a-week boarding, if the parents truly, for career reasons, couldn't give time to that child, then 5-day boarding, if you're an adolescent, may be the answer, as long as the parents understand about attachment and make sure that at weekends they have a strong attachment-based relationship with their child, and give that child the nurture even an adolescent needs. So that's my answer.
Yeah, sure. And that fits in very well with what's put as a question. And Simon, I'm going to read it as a question, but when I read it, I'm hearing something very positive and promising out of it. So people puts the question, is that delayed realization about boarding school as a source of trauma akin to delayed realization of sexual abuse, as if the energy to suppress it runs out and or the maladaptive strategies stop working? Could we be, as we're saying, some people have hit the 40s and this realization has happened, and I suspect with the realization is the new day possible?
I think we've identified, I mean, a couple of points. First of all, I think that the younger you send your children to boarding school, the more risk there is. I mean, I think that's a fairly kind of hard connection. Secondly, I think that one of the things that's come through this evening amongst us and some of the comments is that while one might be very successful in the world out there, from what one learns at boarding school, the weakness seems to be on the relational front. So, you know, it may be that you marry somebody and it seems fine for a bit, and then you kind of realize in actual fact there's something unsatisfactory there. Or quite often it seems to be your kids get to the age when you went off to boarding school, and in actual fact you suddenly get in touch with their vulnerability, and then you realize there's a bit of you which was incredibly neglected, a bit like my experience with my step-grandson. So, and we live in this society where social mobility is held up as the great goal. So, you know, it's difficult. And in some ways, I've been privileged. I've had enough money on, you know, I've earned a bit as well to lead a rather eccentric life. So I kind of balk at really giving out too much advice. But it seems to me, you know, as somebody kindly said to me the other day, when I said I'm not a spring chicken, she said, "Well, you're an autumn chicken." As an autumn chicken, you know, I kind of feel really what's more important are the qualities of relationships than piling up an enormous sum of money in the bank. But you know, that's maybe a reflection of my age.
No, that's fine. So
there's some values I think one has to you know, play off against each other, really.
Yeah. In 2 sentences, Morag, do you want to put your closing remarks, and then I'll come to you. 2 sentences at most. I've run out of time.
I would like to see a much wider conversation in society, not just about education as a model, but you know, about harm to children. You know, children were being belted in Scottish boarding schools right up into the 1990s, and now we look back at it with horror and think, how would we? You know, why was that ever allowed? And I hope one day we'll come to the conclusion, why was early boarding ever considered to be appropriate for a young child?
Thank you, Morag. Simon, you have 1 sentence.
I think we have to take childhood and children much more seriously.
I appreciate that. So thank you, Simon, and thank you, Morag. And we also want to thank everyone for attending the London ACEs Hub discussion and absorbing what the speakers have shared with us. So let me announce that once the webinar is closed, the short feedback form will appear on your screen. Please take a few minutes to complete it and help us plan future events. Everyone will receive a CPD statement via email, and we will let you know when the webinar recording is made public. If you're not already receiving our newsletter, please sign up on our website. This will inform you of ongoing events and developments in this area. You can also become proactively involved by joining the London ACES Hub network. So at this point, let me invite Tiane on behalf of the London ACES Hub to say a few words to the rest of us.
Hello, thanks Mpume, thanks Morag, thanks Simon. I feel quite emotional, to be honest, because today is our last webinar of 2024. It seems like, whoa, like, you know, yeah, I do feel quite emotional. So I do hope you guys enjoyed the evening as much as I did. It was so nice to read your comments, and there is so much more, right, to be spoken about, food for thought and action. Because in the London ACES Hub, we like to bring different ideas, join in strength, but to put things into action for us to make the changes we know is possible, right? So thanks again. And as Mpume said, after you exit the webinar this evening, there will be a feedback form. Please feel very welcome to suggest new topics for us, because we have a whole new year starting very soon. 2025, we'll have lots of opportunities for events again. So do use the feedback form if you would like to offer as well an idea to be involved with the London ACES Hub, to lead the webinar. You are very, very welcome. We are all in favor of raising awareness about adverse childhood experiences, trauma-informed care, and most importantly, how we can build the resilience together, right? Because we do need to look after each other, and that's why we created the London ACES Hub, which is a network bringing survivors, multidisciplinary professionals, and community advocates together. We do believe in change, so feel very welcome to join us and bring in your voice, energy, passion, and everything else. You are very, very welcome. Thanks, Mpume, from the bottom of my heart, Morag, Simon, and everybody who is out there with us this evening. Let's take the message out there and keep doing our bit. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for your backup tonight.
Thanks for this year, Tiane. Let's do it again next year.